Hello, everyone. We need a little more action than that on a Saturday night. You came out on a Saturday night. Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. If I haven't met you yet, or this is your first time at the Vineyard, my name is Beth Guckenberger, and I'm the interim lead pastor here. And I want to welcome you here into the campus this day and online when you're joining us. We're going to be in the third week of our Dear Church series. And I do just want to reiterate a few things that were in those announcements. If you want to get baptized, definitely check out those classes so you can do it. If you want to volunteer at the church, I think it's a great way. If you've been kind of wondering how you could re-engage and find community after the season we've just had, check out how you might be able to volunteer at the Healing Center or with Vineyard Kids or in hospitality. Out there at the tent, we'll have leadership as well as folks that can tell you about those volunteer opportunities. I also want to encourage you, if you are a family who've been waiting for us to announce when children's ministry begins, next Sunday at 11:30, we'll be offering children's ministry in the VK wing. So just come join us. I'm really looking forward to it. We also will need more volunteers to continue to keep that going. So if you're interested in volunteering in children's ministry, let us know. I wanted to, before we jumped into this series, just thank you for all of the messages I've been receiving to my inbox. I asked you a few weeks ago when we were here and I was talking about Ephesus for you to tell me about if you took steps of faith, what happened? What did they look like? How did it feel? What was the result of that? And I got lots and lots of them. I'm going to share one of them with you now. It says, Beth, thank you for your message this weekend. I was inspired and motivated to do something for others as you suggested. I recently had a flagpole installed at my house, which came with an American flag, but since I already had one, I was looking for someplace I could donate the new flag. As I was pulling onto the street where I live, I noticed the house on the corner also had a flagpole, but the flag was torn and faded. Bingo. I stopped by and presented the new flag to my neighbor who I had seen many times but had never had the opportunity to say hi. Once I told him why I wanted to give him the new flag, he said he was just out looking for a new flag the other day. Come to find out, he's a veteran and proudly served in our military. We chatted and agreed to keep in touch. He was very sincere, and when he thanked me, I knew within my heart this was meant to be, and I left satisfied I had blessed someone. I love that story because it's right in the middle of the life that he was living. It's right in the middle of the story that God had him in. I said to you a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to say it more than once tonight probably, if you're looking for an invitation to enter into the culture war that we're in the middle of, here it is. You're invited. The world is desperate to see people reach out, connect, build relationship. I hope that the person who sent me that letter one day will be called upon to give a reason for the hope that he has. And on top of that relationship, he'll be able to tell him about the love of Jesus Christ. That's why we reach out, to create connection in a world that's very disconnected. If you haven't been with us, we've been studying the first couple of chapters of the book of Revelation where John writes to the 7 churches of Revelation. That's what we call them. They're the 7 churches actually along a postal route. And this week we're going to study the church of Sardis. I was able to travel there, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I learned when I was there. But I've had a couple questions from you all wanting to know if in this series that's out of the book of Revelations, we're going to hear predictions about what's going to happen in our future. And I've been telling everybody the same thing. When you read the Old Testament, it's actually all about Jesus. And when you read the New Testament, it's actually all about Jesus. And when you read the book of Revelation, it's actually all about Jesus. He's the star of every story, and he loves you like crazy. And when we read these chapters, we're going to learn more about who he is and how much he loves us and how much he wants us to demonstrate our love for him to a world that doesn't know him yet. He's writing this letter to the church of Sardis because he's telling them, I want you to look like me. And if he was writing a letter to the Vineyard Cincinnati community on this very day, September 12th and 13th of 2020, he'd be saying the very same things. Hey, look like me. Don't let that culture impact you. Reflect me. Talk like me. Engage with people like I do. And how did he look? I want to take a moment before we dive into Revelation and talk about how he very first introduced himself to us, back into the story of his birth and what his birth story has to do with the time frame we're in right now. All this comes out of Luke chapter 1. There was a man named Zechariah, and he was a priest. And priests, they had duties 1 month of the year. There were 12 different divisions of them. They each had a duty 1 month a year. And Zechariah's division served in the month of June. And he had a wife, her name was Elizabeth. And it tells us in the Bible that Zechariah and Elizabeth get pregnant with a baby shortly after his priestly duty. So like maybe the end of June, maybe the beginning of July, something like that. Zechariah and Elizabeth are the parents of John the Baptist, the one that would one day announce the coming of Jesus. When Elizabeth was pregnant 6 months with John the Baptist, she ran into her cousin. And her cousin was named Mary, the virgin mother of Jesus. It says in the Bible that Mary had been freshly conceived with Jesus. So 6 months after the end of June or beginning of July, that would have been around December, right about when they would have been celebrating Hanukkah or the Festival of Lights. So don't let this mess up your Christmas trees, but the light of the world was conceived during the Festival of Lights. Mary carries that baby 9 months. He would have been born right about right now in this 9th month of the year. And that makes a lot of sense to me because this time of year in the Jewish calendar, they celebrate something called the Feast of the Tabernacles. This idea, it's the end of harvest time. They would harvest all their crops, and then they would celebrate that for a period of time. And it was the one time a year that shepherds were allowed into the fields with their animals. Normally, you wouldn't want shepherds in the fields because they'd be eating the crops that are growing there. But one time a year, the shepherds were allowed into the fields with their animals because then they would eat kind of the leftover that didn't get harvested, and then they would deposit a little fertilizer for the growing season to come. In fact, it says in John in the original language that Jesus came and he tabernacled among us right now in this time frame. In Luke chapter 2, verse 8, it says, and there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. We know what's going to happen, right? The angels are going to come and blow their trumpets and announce the coming of Jesus. Now, I want you to imagine the shepherds, all this sheep. The places that animals lived, if you have a nativity scene that has a stable that's made out of really pretty pine, it has like a little plaid blanket that goes into some kind of looking manger, and the hay smells good, you should throw that out. Because where the animals actually stayed would be more like a sheepfold. It would be like almost like a cave that was built into the hillside of Jerusalem, or anywhere over there that they had animals. It makes sense that a shepherd would use a space like that because the natural kind of, if it's a cave built into a hill, it would naturally be 3 of those walls. And what the shepherd would do is he would light a fire in the mouth of the cave to keep the animals in at night. They'd be out in the fields during the day eating and fertilizing. They'd come into this space at night. He'd push them all into this space where the sheep would. Then he'd light a fire in the mouth so that they wouldn't leave in the middle of the night, because sheep can do all kinds of crazy things. And then he'd curl himself up around the fire, and there he'd sleep. And I want you, just use your imagination with me for a minute. Just close your eyes. Just imagine what the floor looked like with all that livestock in that space, all that sheep, probably some goats. Like imagine the dung that would be on that floor. That would have been, laid on top of last night's dung and last week's dung and last month's dung and last year's dung. Like, just imagine what the floor looked like. And the walls would have been thick with the soot of 1,000 shepherds' fires. So I don't know if you've ever touched soot before. You know how it kind of sticks on your fingers even when you don't want it to? So the walls thick with soot. The ground thick with dung. Now here comes Mary. She needs to have a baby. And there's no more room in the inn. So where do they tell her to go? You go over there where the animals stay. You'll have a roof over your head over there. And the light of the world decided to come and tabernacle in literally the most disgusting, dark place I can ever picture in my mind. And you know why? Because he was sending a message to them then and to us today. There's absolutely no place I won't go. Doesn't matter how dark it is, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. I'll go absolutely, I am not afraid of dark and dirty. That's literally where he started his story. And it's important for us to remember because the place of Sardis was a very dark and dirty place. But he didn't take a look at it and go, oh my gosh, I'm not going there. Are you kidding me? Those people are crazy. He said, I've been tabernacling among the dark and the dirty and bringing my light for a really long time. There's 3 facts I want to tell you about Sardis before we read the letter. The first fact is that Sardis they were fascinated with death and dying. They loved death and dying. You can tell because They have this hill that they call the Acropolis. That's where the city is, and it looks exactly like the Necropolis, which is where their cemetery was. They had pyramids all around it. There's lots of evidence that they were obsessed. I love that Jesus through John, picked the town of Sardis to talk about death, a city obsessed with death. He's going to talk to them about death and life in his letter. But when I was studying this, I've known this for a while, but when I picked it up again to prepare for our time together tonight, I was looking at this one incident that happened, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is us. In the year 17 AD, there was an earthquake that rocked Sardis, rocked it. 100,000 people died. And they didn't really recover. They went out into the caves. You can read later prophets talking about them hiding in the caves. They went out into the caves and they hid there for 40 years. They literally lived among the tombs as if they were dead, but they weren't dead. They had this traumatic event, went into hiding, and didn't really recover. Now, I want you to, Back to Back has a ministry in Haiti. We've been going to Haiti for a long time, about a decade, and I remember right after the 2010 earthquake, when I would go to Haiti, you could interact with spirit-filled, educated Haitians, and they would not go into buildings that had second floors. They didn't even like to go into buildings that had roofs on them. They had had a very, very traumatic event, and it impacted the way they lived. And I was thinking to myself, we as a country have had a pretty traumatic event. And in the midst of this traumatic experience, if we aren't careful, we're going to keep hiding out. History looks back on Sardis and can't believe that they got stuck there living among the dead as if they were already for decades on end. And I'm thinking to myself, what's history going to look back on us and say? Are they going to look back about our season of COVID and our response? How long do we want to be hiding out for? And I'm not talking about recklessness and safety. Please don't misunderstand me or send me emails. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about comfortability. I'm talking about what are we doing now, what's just kind of become comfortable. Jesus wants us to look like him. He wants us to smell like him. He wants to demonstrate our love for him. Remember I told you once that as complicated as this book is with 66 different books in it and all that, as complicated as your Bible is, you can really pretty much boil it down to two words: come and go. Come into relationship with Jesus, he asks, and then go out in the world and tell him all about it. As much as I push for you to go out in the world, hear me clearly, Jesus loves you. He loves you more than he wants to use you. But when we go out, we're demonstrating our love for him. Let's make sure we're thinking about flagpoles in our neighbors. We're thinking about what's going on in the world and how our voice might be added to it. This season, it's a perfect time to reset priorities and rhythms. The people of Sardis shrunk back when tragedy struck them. I want us to be a people who rises up. Let's rise up. Let's not hide among the dead. Jesus will tell them, we'll see in a few minutes, strengthen what remains and rebuild. And I think that's very relevant for us in 2020. Strengthen what remains and rebuild. And if you need to, repent. The second fact I want to tell you about Sardis is that the term conquering Sardis was an idiom for doing the impossible. If you're going to try to do something like just impossible, you would say like, you might as well try to conquer Sardis. Like it's impossible to conquer Sardis. And the reason it had that reputation for being impossible to conquer is because it had a king named Croesus. He was a very wealthy king. He became wealthy because his people figured out how to pan gold from a local river using sheep fleece. And he used all that gold and he made himself mighty wealthy, and he built an impenetrable wall all the way around Sardis, and you couldn't get into it. And other people were very envious, the way human nature makes us, for things they don't have, and people tried to conquer Sardis in order to take that gold that they had found, and it didn't happen. Don't really worry about the people groups. Croesus was a Lydian, and there was a Persians who wanted Sardis. And they were camped around wanting to lay siege to Sardis. But they couldn't figure out how to get through. And one day, a Persian soldier noticed a Lydian soldier up on the wall falling asleep. And his head bobbed, and it fell down, and his helmet fell off. And as he watched, a few minutes later, that soldier appeared out of nowhere, retrieved his helmet, went back wherever he came from, and went back to his perch. And that soldier watching realized there's some kind of secret door. And we now know where their weakness is. He went back and told his king, that would be Cyrus. And Cyrus decided to mount an invasion under the cover of nightfall. These little special forces went and found that secret wall. And when they went through, the Lydians were fast asleep. And the mighty, invincible Sardis fell that night. Impossible. But they did. They weren't paying attention in the night. And then unbelievably, it happened a second time, 400 years later. 400 years later, the way that the army that wanted to conquer Sardis, their strategy, I mean, this is so smart. They took a dead donkey and they hurled it over the wall, the impenetrable wall. And then you know what is attracted to dead carcasses? Vultures. So vultures came down, picked at that dead donkey. They couldn't see it, but they knew those vultures would come up and perch on that wall. They're not going to perch where there's a soldier standing. They're going to perch where there's nobody standing, and they paid attention to where the vultures perched, so they knew that those were the places that were left unguarded. Later, under the cover of nightfall, they invaded and found the residents fast asleep. And this city that was strong and impenetrable fell twice because they lacked watchfulness. I was at a football game last night for my son, and I was telling my husband about this story, and I was like, I can't believe. And I said, can you imagine how there are areas of our life that we feel so invincible in? Like, nothing's going to happen to me there. And we were kind of giggling about, I don't know, this is very vulnerable of me, but here we go. I don't know if in your relationships you have like words that, like, if you say that word to a friend or your spouse, it means something more than what it would mean if you said it to me, because it represents an experience that you've had together, you know, like a code word. You can just say like one person's name and you know what that means, or one restaurant you remember something you've had, or one vacation spot or whatever. Well, Todd and I started dating when we were in high school, and he was going to Madeira High School, and I would drive over from where I went to high school over to Madeira to watch his basketball games. And I know that this is not true anymore, but in the late 80s and early 90s, Madeira was a mega force in the basketball world. Okay, I don't know if that's really true, but they beat most of the teams in their league, and they always beat a team in their league called Deer Park. Now, if you're from Deer Park, I know you now have the last laugh. But in those days, Madeira always beat Deer Park. And so what would happen is their basketball team would go out on the basketball floor, and they would not really give it their best, because they knew this was not really a very hard team to beat. And they would kind of laugh around and joke around and not pay attention to the details and not do everything they could. And then at halftime, they'd be down. And then their coach would tell them, hey, wake up, pay attention, do what you've trained to do. You know, you're better than this. Get out there and win. And then they'd always win. Years later, so Todd and I would always use this phrase in our relationship when you're like kind of halfway doing something, when you're winging it, when you're not giving it your all. We always say you're like Deer Parking it. So I hope that doesn't offend anybody from Deer Park, but that was something we said. Years later, we were in Mexico, and we were hosting 8 consecutive weeks of mission trips, and it was at the end of the 7th week, and we were getting ready for our last week, and Todd got this whole huge team in, Mexicans, everybody, and he was talking about, you got to give it your all. I know we've been doing this 7 weeks, and you think you can do this in your sleep, but every single day, you got to give it your all. This is how this works with Jesus. And he said, and he had little T-shirts made for them that said, don't Deer Park it. So now all over Mexico, there are people that know Deer Park like a verb. But here's the deal. These folks, they Deer Parked it. They thought, well, I can fall asleep on the wall. I can leave some of the wall unguarded. It doesn't really matter. We're Sardis. It's impossible to get us. But I'm telling you, this can happen to us. We can let our guard down. We can stop paying attention to the most important of things. And that's where the enemy likes to come and get his foot. And it starts like a foothold, and it grows into a stronghold. And it can take down the best of us. The third fact I want you to know about Sardis is they were in love with a goddess named Kibbalah. And I don't really want to give her too much of our stage time tonight, but I do want to tell you she was a myth, and she was crazy, and the way that they worshiped her was very violent and very sexual, and it was just a mess. And once a year for 40 days, almost 1 million people would gather in Sardis, where her temple was, to worship her. This is a picture I took with my iPhone. On the white, on the right-hand side, those are the ruins of the temple to her, to Kibbalah. And what they would do is they would dress in all white, and they would march around that space for 40 days, and they would hurt themselves. And the bloodier their robes got, the more holier they appeared. And because of part of her myth, there was, she didn't need a man. She was like, both male and female. The way that you became a priest in this faith is you would eventually on the 40th day castrate yourself and then offer that as an offering to her. And if you got the blood from some of that splashed on your robe, you were like extra holy. It was like craziness. And I remember sitting on a hill. That picture was just my iPhone. I remember just looking at that temple and thinking about the millions of people who didn't know what was true, who based their whole life on something that was the equivalent of a cartoon character. And they hurt themselves and they hurt each other. And we know what happens when life is outside of the Lord, like just terrible. And I was just like sick, even though it had happened a long time ago. I was just sick at people who didn't know the truth. It was a dark place. They loved death. They were wildly prideful. And they had this really sick faith. And then comes the people of Jesus, who have been dispersed after the death and resurrection and now sent out into all the world, and they show up in Sardis. And my heart is full because that image on the left side of that picture, that little brick building, is actually the ruins of an early evangelical church. In fact, the fact that it's round, many archaeologists believe it was a medical clinic. You better believe it was probably a medical clinic. Those people would have needed like Band-Aids. They were hurting themselves. I love that the church was bold enough. I have to keep telling you of that Proverbs 28 verse. The righteous are as bold as a lion. We get to be bold. And let me just tell you what bold is. Bold is not posting something on social media. Bold is not talking more than you listen. Bold is giving a flag to your neighbor and knocking on the door when your heart is pounding. Bold is participating in Serve Saturday, which was today. Bold is knocking it on a neighbor's house and inviting them to dinner. It's forgiving your spouse. It's calling an extended family member to which you are estranged. That's what bold is. Bold is not talking into the air and thinking it makes you look better. It doesn't. It doesn't. I told you I've been getting all these letters. One of the letters that I got, when I finished reading it, I thought to myself, this person